Good evening and welcome to the September 10th, 2025 Special Hybrid Planning Commission meeting. I am Vice Chair JB Gibson and Chair Thompson is joining us remotely. Tonight's Hybrid Planning Commission meeting is being brought to you by Zoom. Welcome to all and thank you for joining us tonight. Commissioners, please have your microphones turned on for the roll call. Deputy Clerk, please call the roll.
Thank you, Vice Chair. My apologies. It sounds like I have an echo. Is that better? Good. Okay, Vice Chair Gibson,
Here.
Commissioner Neese,
Here.
Commissioner Perez,
Here.
Chair Thompson, and Commissioner Hughes. Vice Chair, we do have a quorum. I am anticipating that Commissioner Hughes and Chair Thompson will join us later.
Okay. The Planning Commission meets in person and utilizes the Zoom platform for remote participation. I will do my best to recognize commissioners in the order in which hands are raised. After being recognized, you may then ask your question. Our first item of business is public appearances. This is an opportunity for anyone to speak to the commission about issues of concern, except items requiring a public hearing, any quasi-judicial matters, or campaign-related matters. I will note that there is one public hearing related to permanent regulations for temporary uses and structures, including outdoor dining, later this evening, and ask that you hold your comments if they pertain to the hearing. Deputy Clerk, is there anyone who has signed up for public appearances as of 4 p.m. today that wishes to address the commission?
Thank you, Vice Chair. We do have one individual that's signed up. His name is Jeff Haley,
Okay.
and we will work on bringing him on board. Mr. Haley, we see you. Can you test your microphone so that we know that you're good to go?
Hello,
All right, fantastic. You have 3 minutes to speak. Thank you.
thank you. I am the sponsor of a hedge control ordinance considered by the Planning Commission last fall and approved to be put on the agenda. And it went to the City Council and the City Council approved for it to be on the agenda. But I understand the Planning Commission has had other more urgent matters, and so it has been pushed relatively low on the agenda. I am speaking to express my hope that it can be gotten to soon and to ask whether there is anything I can do either before your organization or the City Council to help raise it on the agenda. So that's all I signed up to say, and I'm hoping to get a response.
Chair, would you like staff to respond to that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, the city council sets the work plan for the planning commission and the staff. And so they're the ones that really make the decision about how to prioritize items that were added to the docket. There currently is a pretty large backlog of work. That's mainly related to a lot of state legislation that's passed in the last several years with deadlines that the city must comply with for code amendments. We're still in the thick of that work. Currently, one of the things on the agenda tonight is related to that. And I anticipate that for at least the next year, that's going to continue to be the case. However, Mr. Haley, you're very welcome to appear before the city council during appearances at any time and raise this issue to them. And they are the decision makers for prioritizing work plan items.
Thank you. Is there a place where I can see online the items that are on the agenda ahead of it?
They're not placed in an order, and like I could point you to the place where the items that were added to the docket last year are cataloged.
That would be good. It could be by email, or you could do it now if you prefer.
I don't think I have that website memorized, so I'd be happy to follow up on email.
Perfect. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Aye.
And I'm also seeing Chair Thompson has joined us.
Thank you. I've noted that for the record.
The first item of regular business is to review and consider approving the July 23 meeting minutes. Commissioners, may I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
There is a motion by Commissioner Perez and a second by Commissioner Neese to approve the minutes. Is there any discussion on this item?
No.
Seeing none, Deputy Clerk, please conduct the roll call. Commissioners, please turn on your microphones.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Chair Thompson,
I think you're on mute.
Chair Thompson, you're muted at the moment.
Aye.
Thank you. Vice Chair Gibson,
Aye.
Commissioner Neese,
Aye.
and Commissioner Perez.
Aye.
Thank you.
The second item of regular business is Planning Commission Agenda Bill 2515, public hearing on permanent regulations for temporary uses and structures, including outdoor dining. This public hearing is to receive the public comments on permanent regulations for temporary uses and structures, including outdoor dining. Individuals wishing to make public comment on this agenda item may do so in person or by using Zoom. This public hearing is now open as of 6:07 p.m. Deputy Clerk, is there anyone who has signed up for public comment that wishes to address the commission?
No, Vice Chair.
There being no testimony, the public portion of this hearing is now closed as of 6:07 p.m. The next item of regular business is the Planning Commission Agenda Bill PCB 2515 on permanent regulations for temporary uses and structures, including outdoor dining parks zone development code amendment. Welcome Deputy CPD Director Allison Van Gorp and Senior Planner Molly McGuire.
Let me just share my screen. We've got a couple of very short slides for you. So we'll just recap the process from how this started until today. Started back in December of 2023 when the City Council approved the 2024 docket, which added establishing regulations for temporary uses and structures. And then interim regulations have been renewed several times since then and will now expire on December 16th of 2025. So if you remember back in February, we had the first reading of these draft regulations. And then in June, we had the first public hearing and the second reading where Planning Commission gave lots of feedback and direction on three kind of buckets that staff had prepared. And then staff came back in July with a draft that incorporated all of that direction. And so during the July meeting, the Planning Commission made several motions to adopt several amendments, 15 additional amendments, and some amendments that were made in response to the June 10th feedback. And so because there were so many changes between the July or the first public hearing and now we decided to have a second public hearing, which was today. And so the last outstanding item is to vote on the main motion that was tabled on the July 23rd meeting. And that main motion is up on the screen. And if you have any questions, happy to answer them now.
Are there any questions?
No, not questions, but are we going to, it's an opportunity to discuss some of these items as is this the opportunity to discuss?
If there's any questions for staff, otherwise we'll move into a motion to make a recommendation on the regulations that we worked on last time. And then if there's any items that we want to talk about during the motion, we can do that as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. Any other comments? Commissioners, may I have a motion to recommend that the city council adopt the proposed amendments to MICC 1906-050 Commerce on Public Property as amended, proposed new section MICC 1906-130 Temporary Use Permits as amended, and proposed amendments to MICC 1915-030 Land Use Review Types as amended.
So moved.
Is there a second?
I second.
All right. There is a motion by Commissioner Neese and a second by Commissioner Perez to recommend that the city council adopt the proposed amendments. Is there any discussion on this item?
Sorry, I'm gonna jump in here. This is a principal planner, Adam Zach. Just for a clarification from the city clerk. This motion was made on the 10th and then tabled. Is that right? I think,
Yes, it's been tabled actually a couple of times now. And so this is where we're at. And if there's no additional modifications, then this is the only thing that we need to do for this item.
okay, so it's just calling the question on the motion
the
that was
question-
already tabled.
Yep,
Okay.
it was tabled for tonight, and this is the second time it was tabled?
I just wanted to make sure
No.
that the motion didn't get made twice.
Nope,
it wasn't-
completely understand. At this
Okay.
point, we're just moving forward with what was tabled previously.
Thanks for the clarification.
Thank you.
This is Chair Thompson, and I would just have some brief comments. First, I would really like to thank Chair JB Gibson, how hard he worked trying to work. And I'd also like to thank staff. I think that we got a very bad temporary ordinance, and I think it's a terrible mistake to allow non-conforming structures in the residential zone, but that is what we were dealt. And this is about, I guess, the best that we could do. So I'm going to support it. We put a lot of work into it. I think it can get any better than it is. One comment I do have as it goes back to the CPD, as someone right now who is dealing with a permit with the city, they can be expensive and they can be very complicated, even for a lawyer. So I hope in the town center, people who fall into the permit requirements, it's easier than what I found online and not expensive. And my hope is that the fire code saves us in the future on these. But I think this is the best that we could do, and I really appreciated Vice Chair JB Gibson's work on it.
Thank you for that. Any other comments? All right, seeing none, Deputy Clerk, please conduct a roll call vote. Commissioners, please turn on your microphones.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Commissioner Neese,
Aye.
Commissioner Perez,
Aye.
Vice Chair Gibson,
Aye.
and Chair Thompson. Chair Thompson,
Aye.
thank you.
Motion passes. Now we will move to the staff presentation and discussion of Agenda Bill 2516 Study Session Omnibus Legislation related to permanent regulations for housing production and permit streamlining. Welcome, Principal Planner Adam Zach.
Great, thank you. So I've got a little longer slide deck this time. Some additional material here. Let me share my screen. There we go. Okay, so this is our second briefing on this matter. We took this up at the last Planning Commission meeting. I gave you a quick overview of kind of the topics that we'll be addressing with this omnibus legislation. And now I want to kind of get into the actual meat of what those amendments are going to look like. Our purpose tonight with the briefing is to go through those code amendments and prepare you for the public hearing that we have planned for September 24th. So that we can get through this in the time allotted as we have quite a bit before us here. So for some background, in the last few years, the Washington State Legislature has adopted many bills that require local jurisdictions to update their development code. Particularly those state bills deal with housing and our permit processes. And so since 2021, the city has adopted several interim ordinances to address those permit process and housing related bills from the legislature to maintain compliance with the state law. Those interim ordinances adopt temporary regulations or temporary changes to our regulations. And so over the life of that, to maintain compliance with those bills, we have to renew those interim ordinances. And so every time that we have to renew those ordinances, it requires a process before the city council. It may be helpful to note that each of the bills that we'll be responding to here, each of the interim ordinances, I should say, have gone before the city council at least once for a public hearing, and in most cases more than once. So that brings us to this omnibus legislation that's before you today. The city is planning to adopt amendments to address all of those interim ordinances more or less at the same time because a bunch of our sections of code that have been amended by interim ordinances, several of them have overlapping topics that they're addressing, overlapping state law that they're addressing. So if we consider everything at once, it'll give us a chance to kind of overview the sum total of those amendments and see how they interact kind of within each of those sections where they're layered on there. We did get a project scope of work with a rough schedule from the city council that envisions adopting these amendments prior to the end of the year. As Allison had mentioned earlier with speaking about the docket, we're trying to kind of clear the decks here so that we can get on to the next round of work that we have ahead of us. So this will help us knock out some of those overlapping interim ordinances. There's 3 topics that are specifically not in the omnibus legislation: middle housing, accessory dwelling units, and unit lot subdivision. We've adopted interim regulations to address all 3 of those in the recent legislation that has to do with middle housing, ADUs, and unit lot subdivision. We're not including them in this project because there's been a high degree of public interest in those regulations in particular. And so we want to go through a separate process for those to allow for some additional public input on those specifically. And we're projecting that we'll have a scope of work for that project to adopt those. We'll bring that forward at some point in 2026. That's what we're shooting for. As I mentioned at the July meeting, I gave you an overview of each of the bills that we'll be addressing. There's also so there's 7 topics total that we'll be addressing. I won't go into each one because, again, that briefing we went into a lot more detail. But I wanted to highlight 3 of these topics because these are where there are some additional amendments in the omnibus legislation that's over and above what's been adopted in those interim ordinances. So I've kind of pulled those out so that we can take a closer look at those 3 tonight. The first one is House Bill 1220, and this has to do with affordable and emergency housing. I would guess that that's going to be kind of the bulk of our briefing tonight. We'll take a look in pretty great detail at what's being proposed there. The second is House Bill 1998. The city has not adopted an interim ordinance to address this bill related to co-living housing. We're required to comply with the state law before the end of the year. And so this will take care of that. We can get that adopted without adopting an interim ordinance. So we'll take a look at that in a little detail tonight. And then finally, the Design Commission, as part of the process of complying with House Bill 1293, which has to do with our design standards, the City Council decided to dissolve the Design Commission in June of this year. And as a result, there's a lot of references to the Design Commission in our city code that don't necessarily need to be removed, but removing them can clarify kind of where the decision is, or it won't be as difficult to tell who would be making that decision, because we can put all of that into chapter 1915 of the code, where we have all of our permit procedures established. So it's just a little bit of housekeeping on that Design Commission piece. So we'll take a little closer look here in a moment. I should note too, my plan for the presentation tonight, I'm going to go through some slides here to kind of touch on each of these three topics. And then after that, I'll open up the draft code and give you kind of a flyby on these like key pieces of the legislation. So as we go through it, I'll have a couple of slides talking about each of these topics. I'll pause for questions as I get to the end of each section. And so we can answer questions then. And then when we go through the ordinance and actually look at the strike through and underline, we can get into any questions that the commission might have at that time too. So we'll just work through it here. To start with, I wanted to touch on, before I go on, are there any questions on kind of the process of our discussion tonight? Okay, great. I'll keep rolling then. So the first topic we'll look at, this is, like I said, kind of one of the bigger topics in the omnibus legislation. It's House Bill 1220. Specifically, our proposed amendments related to shelters, transitional, emergency, and permanent supportive housing, which we've abbreviated as STEP housing. So as I refer to STEP, that's kind of those four different types of housing. The proposed amendments combined some definitions from the state legislation into some existing definitions in the city code. And we'll take a look kind of specifically at how that was done when we get into the code section, the code review section. But permanent supportive housing was added to the definition of special needs group housing. And then shelter, the state definitions from shelters, transitional, and emergency housing were clarified in social service transitional housing. So those three things were more or less listed in that definition in the existing term, but we just clarified in how the definition is worded that also includes these things from the state law. From House Bill 1220, transitional and permanent supportive housing must now be allowed in all zones where dwelling units are allowed. And then the shelter and emergency housing must be allowed in all zones where hotels are allowed. So that's one of the key requirements we're addressing with the proposed amendments here. And we'll take a look at how that shakes out in the code here in a moment. One of the nuances here is that per the Commerce guidance and one of the provisions in the RCW, a city may not adopt, impose, or enforce requirements on an affordable housing development that are different than the requirements imposed on housing developments generally. So that means as we're looking through it, some of the draft proposes striking some of the like operational requirements for social service transitional housing and the special needs group housing. And that's in response to this requirement from the state law. And that's consistent with how the Commerce guidance kind of laid it out. There's also a provision that any intensity of use, spacing, or occupancy standards can only be in place subject to a demonstrated health or safety concern. And so in the draft, there's some proposed, the spacing requirements are proposed to be struck because we don't necessarily have a demonstrated health or safety concern kind of backing those up. So as we look at the draft and as we move forward with your review, if the spacing requirements were a concern, we can look at, maybe making a finding, asking for a study to kind of establish that link. But until we have a link established between the spacing requirement and the health or safety concern, it'd be really challenging to get that through because of the requirement from the state law. So I'm sure we'll talk about that more than once again as we go through this. So prior to any of the amendments that were made by the interim ordinances, special needs group housing was allowed outright in all of the zones, and social service transitional housing was allowed by conditional use permit in all zones. As I mentioned earlier, the definition of social service transitional housing, it already included emergency shelters, homeless shelters, and transitional housing. The proposed amendments here just clarify that where the definition said emergency shelters, homeless shelters, and transitional housing, that includes those emergency housing, emergency shelter, and transitional housing from the state law definition. So we'll take a look at the definition here in a minute when we get into the code. And so those are more or less the requirements that we were addressing with our interim regulations. Those were adopted in 2021 with Ordinance 21C23. And those interim regulations that were adopted in 2021 have been renewed through to today. Now, there's been some water under the bridge since 2021 and today. So I kind of wanted to walk through that here in this section of the presentation. Because when the council adopted that ordinance 21C23, they directed that the permanent regulations allow emergency shelters and emergency housing in the smallest geographical area kind of required under the state law. And this is likely where hotels are allowed because those are only allowed in a handful of zones in the city. The way that the amendment ended up being adopted and is proposed in the draft carried forward from the interim ordinance is that those uses would continue to be allowed in the residential zones and instead of requiring a conditional use permit, because we can't necessarily require a conditional use permit for them, they'd be allowed outright. And we can, again, we'll look at this kind of in the code as well. We can see it in line. In the 4 years since that direction was given to us and we adopted that interim ordinance, we've also had assigned emergency housing needs from the county as part of our comp plan update. So we have a certain number of emergency housing units we need to be planning for in our comprehensive plan. We've also, Commerce has issued guidance for step housing and how kind of the best practices for regulating step housing. And then also our comprehensive plan update was adopted, and that kind of established through that process, we looked at the development capacity for those emergency housing units that we had allocated from that we needed to plan for according to the county. And we found that under the interim regulations, there was adequate capacity to accommodate those emergency housing units. At that time, we didn't evaluate if they were only allowed in the zones where hotels are allowed, whether that would provide enough capacity for emergency housing and the allocated need for emergency housing. So all of that is to say that if the Planning Commission would like to consider an amendment to limit emergency housing and emergency shelters to only those zones where hotels are allowed. The way that we can kind of get there is if you direct staff or you ask staff to draft an amendment, this will give us a chance to take a look at how that would be, how that could be accomplished in the code given the state requirements. It'll also give us a chance to do that additional analysis to see whether or not that would leave us with enough emergency housing capacity to satisfy that countywide requirement. And then that would give us a chance to kind of present that information to the commission before you make your final recommendation. So that's just, it had been raised as the council was considering the last renewal that this might be an issue. And so we thought we'd bring it forward and kind of show you that's the path if that's where the commission wants to go. That's the direction that we can get to addressing that concern.
Zach, this is Chair Thompson. Can I just ask a question and make a point?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, as you know, I was the one who raised this issue on the emergency shelters at the last council meeting, although I don't know anybody read my email until afterwards. And the 2021 council meeting on this issue, the council gave direction that emergency shelters would only be allowed in zones where hotels are allowed, which is the town center and 2 or 3 multifamily. So, I think now everybody understands that when emergency shelters at the last council meeting was added to the definition of social service transitional housing, which is allowed in all zones, all of a sudden we now had emergency shelters in the residential zones and every zone. So the council, I think, is expecting us to come back and remove emergency shelters from the residential zone and go back to what their direction was. I think there was some confusion in what they got, and it will only be allowed in the zones that hotels are allowed, depending if we have the capacity. Is that your understanding?
Right. If you would like to move forward with an amendment to the draft that would kind of constrain this to those zones where hotels are allowed, we just need to kind of know that that's the direction you want to go, and then we can do that analysis work, because it is contingent on whether or not there's adequate capacity for those emergency housing units. Unfortunately, that's the one piece of this puzzle that ties our hands a bit. So we need to do the math on that and make sure that the math kind of squares so that we're compliant with those other pieces of GMA and housing planning generally. Yeah. Okay,
great. That's my understanding too. So we'll parking lot. The only reason I bring this up because I know that with time frame and the scope of this, we want to reduce our substantive amendments. But I believe from my discussions with the mayor and some council members, they're expecting this to be one substantive amendment, depending on capacity.
And I would add, and we'll take a look at it here in the code in a minute, but if that's the direction that the planning commission wants to go, I need to know tonight because I've got to get working like after the meeting. Because there's some tables and some analysis that needs to go into that ahead of time. So if that's where we want to go, just kind of before the end of this agenda item, we can kind of get that general direction, and then I'll bring something back to you, likely on the 24th for the public hearing.
Great.
You need a formal motion for that, or just a thumbs up, thumbs down?
I think for this one, if we can get, if no one would block consensus, I can move forward with that. And then we'll need a formal motion to make the amendment into the draft, but.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there any opposition to kind of just discussing this now and let's do it while we're on the topic here?
Yeah,
Do you have?
I think I would support it. Adam, I was curious about that guidance from Commerce on step housing. Is that a document? I know we talked about that being shared.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that document. Is there anything useful in there that would help influence our decision?
There is. It's it's pretty substantial. So I do plan on sharing that before the public hearing so that you have a chance to review that. But this step housing piece is particularly complicated, so that guidance can help kind of give a little bit of a roadmap. I think Commerce also produced a shorter like summary document, so I'll make sure to get that to you before to the commission before we next meet. Yeah.
Commissioner.
This is Chair Thompson. I would kind of lean towards Vice Chair Gibson. Why don't we get a consensus on that now so we don't forget it or it gets lost? Because this is important and it is expected at the council that we correct this error. There specific guidance that emergency shelters only be allowed in zones with hotels. Somehow just got lost, and there was a recent council meeting where emergency hotels got put into the social service transitional housing definition, which is allowed in all zones. So I think that we should right now just give that guidance so we don't forget it and we know that that's taken care of.
Commissioner Perez.
Thank you very much. I just had two quick questions. One, I know that there's regarding this that there is a non-compliance notification that we've received from the state. Is that anything specific associated with the hotel? Is there a one-to-one relationship or?
There is a bit of a nexus here. So one of the and I'll if you want to jump in at any moment, Kim, please feel free. Our city attorney turned the camera on, so maybe I should turn it over to her for that answer.
Okay, thank you.
You know, we got our growth management hearings board decision back and we lost to the growth board on 3 of issues. And, but this is one where the city was found compliant, that we did do the capacity for emergency housing such that we met the target and did the capacity analysis correctly. So as it stands, it is compliant with state law.
Thank you.
And I would add a follow-on to that. So as we're, with what you're asking, what you would be asking me for tonight is that additional analysis looking at it just in the hotel zone. And there's a potential that part of that analysis could show that there's inadequate capacity if we just limit it to hotel, like zones where hotels are allowed. In which case we would need to then look back at allowing it everywhere, because we know allowing it everywhere consistent with the interim ordinance as it's been adopted since 2021, that we did the capacity analysis for that. And we know that that was enough capacity. So there is that possibility. Again, without having the numbers, I can't say what kind of possibility that is, but it's within the realm of possibility. So we just need to do that analysis to make sure that we stay compliant with that piece, because we did win on it and we should. Yeah.
A question on
Right.
follow up on
Okay.
that comment. So if we find out that we don't have the capacity in the zones where hotels are allowed, I imagine there's an alternative too, where we could allow it in additional zones, not necessarily everywhere, but enough to get us to that capacity.
Correct. We could look at some alternatives there. We could also, one of the other options, if we get to that point, is you could highlight this as a concern and then make a finding to the effect of, in addition to our recommendation, we're concerned about allowing emergency shelters everywhere in the city, and we would like to study this further. And then that'll give the council the opportunity to assign that work to the planning commission, and we can do a deeper dive on it. But that's kind of that's the other option if we find that there's inadequate capacity. We can
And that's later down the road. We don't have to kind of get that direction now, right?
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, we have like a minimum set by the state law, and then we can, as long as we meet that minimum, we have some flexibility in local options. So we can take a look at that once we get that analysis piece kind of put together.
Okay. Are there any other comments or questions from commission? All right, can we just do a simple thumbs up, thumbs down if you want to proceed with the study and have them look at our capacity in those zones? So commissioners, give your thumbs. I think I see half a thumb from Chair Thompson up there.
And commission, just for the record, I'm going to note that there was consensus among the 4 commissioners present. In the past, not with this commission, we've had challenges with consensus versus taking motions, so just going to put it in the record so that we're all on the same page. Okay, thank you.
Thank
I
you.
agree with that.
Great. Well, now I know what the rest of my September is going to look like. Let me jump back in the slide. So that was my last slide on the HB 1220. Like I said, that's kind of the beefiest piece of this this project. Now we'll take a look at co-living housing, which has to do with House Bill 1998. In the draft, we're proposing an amendment of the definition of rooming house, which is an existing use in the city code, and amending that definition to clarify that it includes co-living housing. This is kind of the cleanest way to get there because a rooming house is already allowed in our multifamily and mixed-use zones. So that simple change kind of that would comply with that requirement from the state law. There's some other requirements from HB 1998. Sleeping units can only count as 1/4 of a dwelling unit for the purpose of calculating density. And then the city cannot require more than 1/4 of a parking space per sleeping unit. So again, that's like the rooms within the co-living housing or within the rooming house. The other key here is that the co-living housing must be subject to the same standards as multifamily. So we had to make some minor changes to how rooming houses were regulated under the existing code to meet that requirement as well. And then finally, the Design Commission removal. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the City Council dissolved the Design Commission in June. And the design review was through that process was reassigned to the hearing examiner. In the draft, the references to the Design Commission throughout the development code are proposed to be struck. And that's to kind of clean it all up so that in 1915, where we have established the process and decision maker for our different permit types, it's all kind of contained within chapter 1915. So we'll take a look in a minute here. I'll open up the code and I'll show you a quick example of this. We won't go through all of them because there's a bunch of places where it's struck, but that's the other piece of this. I don't think I need to go through the comments. We talked about this briefly in July. We're going to categorize the comments your comments as they come into substantive and non-substantive, with those substantive comments being things that are directing changes kind of over and above what's in the draft, and non-substantive would be clarifying amendments. And our recommendation is going to be that those substantive comments, with the exception of this hotels issue that we talked about earlier, all the other substantive comments we'll put into a parking lot for you to consider later. So we don't lose those ideas, but we don't necessarily delay this project to address those. And you'll have a chance to review that categorization. And if you think I'm lost my mind and I'm categorizing things wrong, you have a chance to recategorize those at the public hearing on the 24th. I didn't include it on the slide here, but one of the next steps for this project, the comment period for the Planning Commission, we're asking for your comments by no later than the 17th, so 1 week from tonight. If As you're reviewing this, if you'd like to take a look at this with staff, I can be available if you want to give me a call. We just have to one at a time, so we don't have a rolling public meeting. But I can help kind of walk through stuff if you have additional questions. And then the public hearing is slated for September 24th. And we're planning to continue the public hearing to October 8th. Partially to resolve the issue that we had in July of this year where you had made a bunch of changes to the draft and then we needed to have an additional public hearing. Where at this point, we'll just roll it ahead for that next week and then we can make sure that we've had a public hearing on the amended draft. And then if necessary, we're holding the October 22nd for a final touch if there's something that hasn't been wrapped up by the 8th. And then from there, we'll take this to the city council in November, looking to get this kind of adopted and effective by the end of the year so we can stop dealing with interim ordinances. Staff's very excited about that prospect. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen before I jump into looking.
This is, I don't want to lose this. This is Chair Thompson. In the proposed comments, or is it proposed amendments that you want on the 17th, kind of like we've done before, where there is a matrix and we do it? I personally not going to be a big fan of any type of wordsmithing ones. So do you want us to put what we think would be substantive amendments for the, I guess, parking lot by the 17th? Or will there be a chance that we're going to be able to come back and revisit substantive amendments down the road?
Sure. I mean, if you are going through it and you think this is something that can wait and go in the parking lot, absolutely provide it by the 17th. Like, we're more than happy to kind of add that stuff and get that list going already. That conversation will dovetail nicely into our docket conversations at the end of October too. So if you have substantive comments, you don't feel like you need to hold those back. But we are looking for any proposed amendments by the 17th so that you all have at least a week to review those in advance of the public hearing. Any other questions? All right. Well, I'm sure there will be more here. I'm going to open the code and I'll just walk through a couple of examples of the proposed amendments. Let's see here. There it is. So first, I wanted to point out in the draft that's publicly available now, we included a notation guide at the beginning. I went through and as I was preparing these amendments and compiling the amendments from the interim ordinances, I kept track of where they came from and what topic they addressed. So you can see in line kind of where each of these proposed amendments came from. And that's all explained at the beginning of the document. So if the public at home is going through this, that's a helpful guide that I didn't want to get lost once we get deep in here. The first amendment I wanted to highlight, this is just an example of one of the Design Commission amendments. I don't know if this is, let me make my screen a little bigger here. But the proposed amendment would to 1902-010 would strike the reference to the Design Commission here in A4 of that section. And really, this reference to the Design Commission is not necessary. It was pretty much duplicative. And at this point, the hearing examiner or the code official would make that determination based on other requirements of the code. And so we can kind of clarify that and get that out of there. And you'll see throughout the draft where we've cited the DC topic, that's more or less what the amendment is. So those ones are relatively straightforward because again, we're just clarifying what's in the code. The bulk of the changes that pertain to the other topics that I covered in my slide deck are made in 1906, what is it, 080, the siting of group housing. And as you can see, we've struck some of those operational requirements, again, because a lot of, we need to apply the same standards that are generally applicable to residential development in the zones. And so we don't have, in the same way, we don't have operational requirements for multifamily development. We can't have, or we don't want to have those operational requirements for these affordable housing types and emergency housing types. So those are proposed to be struck in response to, again, you can see the notation HB 1220. On the notation too, those things that are in green highlight, those are going to get removed from the draft before they get adopted. We're not going to have a bunch of weird citations in the code. One of the other changes here in social service transitional housing, the draft proposes striking the conditional use permit requirement for social service transitional housing. And this is because, again, we can't require a permit process over and above what's generally applicable to residential development. Since we don't require a conditional use permit for other residential developments, we're proposing striking that requirement here. There's a little bit of reorganization. The proposed A, B, and C, these are all relocated from a different section of the code. It just made sense to do that given the breadth of the other amendments here. And then you'll see the second half of these amendments to the requirements for social service transitional housing are again directed at the operational requirements. So proposing that we strike a requirement that the police chief find that there's not a safety concern. That's kind of not really a land use issue to begin with. And then, there's some of these other operational requirements. I will point out here that we propose striking that spacing requirements. Again, we have to have some kind of health or safety link to demonstrate that there's a health or safety concern that those spacing requirements are addressing. We don't really have that work now. So as you're reviewing this, if you're concerned about the spacing between these facilities or spacing these facilities from other uses, the way that we can address that is by making a finding to accommodate or to accompany your recommendation that says we'd like to study whether or not there's a health or safety concern here that can be addressed. We just need that evidence before we can implement any kind of spacing requirement.
Adam, I'm sorry to break in.
Sure.
Lose these things by having somebody go back to this massive omnibus bill and then miss this. Is this something that we can do now as the planning commission to you and sit there and say, we want to make this something, we want to not just so much the parking lot, but on the next meeting and stuff, have spacing an issue or bring it up kind of like what we just did on the emergency shelters?
So on this one in particular, on the spacing issue, I would recommend that you put it in the parking lot, but you can, when you do that, make sure that it's clear that this is like a major area of concern. The problem here, unlike the hotel zone piece of this, the analysis that we would need to do is a lot more in depth than what we could do in the time frame that we have for these getting these amendments through before the end of the year. So, which is not to say that it can't be a priority. It's just it would be really challenging to get that, if not impossible, to get that through in the time frame that the Planning Commission has. So if it's added to the parking lot, maybe as we assemble that parking lot, we can put an asterisk on it and say this is like a Planning Commission priority. That can be made more clear than just like it doesn't just go in a folder and sit on the hard drive on my computer. Like we'll make sure to bring that forward. And again, we can kind of look at that as part of this docketing procedure that we have in place for you to make requests to the council about work plan items. So there's some flexibility there. I just would caution against recommending some kind of spacing requirement at this stage, because we just, unless you have access to some kind of report that I don't know about, like we have to have some kind of demonstrated need for it as regards to health and safety specifically. I was going to point out too that there are some spacing requirements in the state law in terms of facilities that house sex offenders. So even though we don't have it in our land use code, there are some of these other requirements that would apply. And that gets kind of swept up in one of the conditions that we've maintained in this draft is that these facilities need to get any kind of license that's required by the state in advance of operation. So there is a little bit of a fail safe there, even if it's not in our code, it's set in the state code.
I'm sorry to ask this question, Zach.
Sure.
Just this may be very rudimentary, but are definitions such as spacing and the actual definition of emergency, is that all in 1916, or have you updated that?
It is,
in
yeah.
there? Okay.
It's all in 1916. We'll take a look here in a second.
Okay.
Because I don't know, the definitions are an interesting thing to look at too. I think just
Yeah.
since some of you are like newer to reading code, it'll be helpful for the next time we get to it as well, to kind of know where that stuff is. Let's see, I'm gonna just keep rolling here. So I think I touched on most of what the proposed amendments are. As I mentioned, there's kind of a lot of strike through in here, but that's because we have those layers of state requirements for emergency housing. But I would recommend if that's the piece that you're interested in, take a look at 1906-080. If you see something and you want to propose an amendment, that would be by September 17th. If you see something and you have a question, feel free to reach out to me. We can kind of look at that together if you need that. I really want to accommodate that question and answer piece, but we're on a bit of a crunch to get this through. So sometimes it might be useful to just have a 15-minute call as well. But again, only one at a time. So that's our emergency housing piece of it. Also in 1906-080 is the amendments to the rooming houses regulation. And this is pertaining to House Bill 1998. The existing code had quite a few operational requirements, which again, we had to propose striking those because of the requirements from the state law that these uses be subject to the same standards as multifamily residential. So some of these requirements here needed to be struck for that reason, because we don't have those operational requirements. And you can see here, even we just point back to the multifamily residential uses in that zone for those dimensional standards. So it's subject to the same setback, yard, and height standards. And then the parking is the piece here that we can only require 1/4 of a stall per sleeping unit. And then there's another piece of the state law that we can't require parking within, what is it? 1/2 mile of a transit stop. So this kind of establishes that we can't require the parking there. And then the other piece that I didn't touch on in my presentation, the state law specifically calls out a mix of uses, and that for co-living housing, the city can't require ground floor commercial uses for co-living housing development. Not really a problem in most of our zones, but in the town center zone, we do have some areas that require ground floor commercial. So you'll see 5 here specifically exempts co-living housing from that requirement. We're rolling here, so I'm gonna jump to definitions. This is the other piece that touches on these specific topics. You'll see there's quite a few. A lot of these definitions are just kind of to maintain consistency with the amendments we've made elsewhere. But the definition of rooming houses, social service transitional housing, and special needs group housing are kind of the bigger changes. These are all, it's worth noting too, that all of the strike through and underline that you see in the draft is set relative to the code, relative to the code that existed before these interim regulations were adopted. So anything that you see struck through, that's something that existed before essentially 2021 when we first started adopting these interim ordinances. And then anything that's underlined is a new addition to, again, that code that existed 4 years ago. So here's, that's all in 1916. If you'd like, we can look at each one of these in particular, or I can wrap it up there if you're tired of listening to me talk.
No, Zach, this is Dan Thompson. Just since you have it up on the social service transitional housing, to the commission members, this was the issue that I raised to the council with, I think it was recent amendments. At the very end, you can see where emergency housing was added to the social service transitional housing. And that was the concern I had, because social service transitional housing is allowed in all zones, including the residential single family zone. And now emergency housing is, and Zach's already gone over that. We've already given them a thumb up about taking emergency housing out of the social service transitional housing and putting it in something separate that would clarify, if we can, that it's only allowed in zones with hotels.
Thanks. Yeah, I think this is definitely part of the code that I'll need to look at as part of that. I think the key here is that the transitional housing from the state definition, that piece has to be allowed in zones where dwelling units are allowed. So there'll have to be some slicing and dicing to get this kind of lined up with that, but that'll be part of the process. Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions while I have this up?
I did want to follow up on, I sent you a note about throughout the 080 section, as part of the language that's getting struck pertains to the police chief being able to determine that an individual is a health or safety concern for the neighborhood or so on. It's struck throughout kind of multiple sections here. I also heard you say that that's not really a land use issue, but if it's not, then kind of where does that belong, or does it already belong somewhere outside of the land use arena? But kind of curious your take on that.
Yeah. This is a strange provision for a zoning code. There's things pertaining to public safety and particularly police operations. We have a criminal code that's established at the city level. That's really where that belongs. We're primarily looking at like health, safety, and welfare from how do things fit in the built environment, whereas like the day-to-day, what is somebody posing as a safety risk, that's really better handled in the criminal code. And it is unusual to have it in your land use code. I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Right. And do we know if the authority kind of described in this language that's being struck already exists in the criminal code, or?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I mean, I don't know that this is the way to, because we're really talking about permitting like structures and then the uses that happen in them. And so it's really difficult to then kind of defer to another body to do that. So I can take a look at the criminal code before our next one and see if and I can consult with our legal team on that, and we can take a look at how that's addressed elsewhere before the
Okay.
next meeting.
Yep.
Yeah.
I agree. It was interesting seeing that in the land use section. That any other comments or questions?
I have a question. As I read through all of this, as we know, the council sunsetted the design commission because 1220 and some others wanted to remove subjective criteria from the code. They want there to be objective criteria. But the way the system works is we have a design commission and we have a planning commission to make sure that there's citizen oversight of the decisions and the codes that are being made by the planning department. Even when we take this out, what happens, we take out the design commission, but there's a number of sections where there still resides pretty substantial discretion, but now with the code official that won't have any oversight by the design commission. And that really, in particular, I see it for reducing parking minimums. I noticed that, and there's some others. And I'm trying to wonder, are we at some point going to get to the point where we remove that discretion from the code official, which almost always means the assigned planner, or leave it in there so that it's the discretion of the CPD, but it doesn't have any oversight by a citizen board. You know, I know that Commissioner Perez was on the design commission, so that's what you would have. That would be the backstop. You would have architects and other people coming on there, and they would review a decision that would come to them saying, well, we can reduce parking here for 25% or allow adjoining lots to combine their parking. So that's just kind of a conceptual thing. As I go through, if I'm preparing my amendments, should I be looking at ones that I think the discretion shouldn't be there? For example, the ability to reduce parking minimums 25% by the code official, but no longer with any oversight by the design commission.
Vice Chair, may I be recognized briefly here to respond to that?
Yes, please. CPD
Thank
Director.
you. Yeah, for the record, CPD Director Jeff Thomas, thank you. I just want to note it's important for us to all realize the Design Commission has been dissolved. The authority, though, that the Design Commission formerly had now rests with the city's hearing examiner, not the code official. So that's an important distinction to make here as we're discussing this. Jeff suddenly didn't get a bunch of additional decision-making authority or any future CPD director. The council direction was clear. The authority goes to the hearing examiner, and those are part of the amendment package. Now, in regard to Chair Thompson's second part, should there be discussion about looking at the code in terms of whatever the planning commission may wish to look at in regard to those design and development standards. If there's changes that wish to be made, it would follow the rest of the normal process we're going to follow here with the omnibus ordinance and like we do with other projects. So Adam, anything else? Thank you.
Yeah, I would add, so you brought up parking specifically. Where there's a proposed change, a lot of those parking standards and some of the places where the design commission had discretion in the previous code, Those were amended or proposed to be amended in response to House Bill 1293, which requires our design standards to be clear and objective, meaning that they have at least one measurable criterion by which they are can be determined that somebody meets that or a proposed development meets that requirement. So with parking in particular, there's quite a few places in the draft where we're proposing to strike the parking, the design commission piece of that parking decision. But we've replaced that with a requirement that the applicant submit a parking study that objectively looks at what's the condition on the site, what's the proposed development, how many parking spaces are going to be needed. And the decision then, even if it rests with the code official because of another process, the decision must be based on that objective study. So there is some of that backstop there, and that's the 1293 connection here, I think is really would be helpful as you're reading through this to remember that we have to have for any place that we're requiring some kind of building design element, we have to have a clear and objective standard for that requirement. Yeah, so I
Okay,
think, yeah.
I'm a lawyer and I
Mhm.
hire experts all the time. I don't rely on the opponent or applicant's expert. That's always been my concern, that the planning department too often accepts the findings of the applicant's expert, which are questionable. I mean, recently, the planning department did actually question the applicant's parking expert's findings for the Herzl B zone property and determined that it was not accurate. So that's just what I'm just saying that that's a concern of mine, that there's no longer going to be citizen oversight on the design commission of a decision. And I maybe it's just me practicing law for 37 years. I take expert opinion from the other side with a grain of salt.
Okay, well, if it sounds like you may have some dissatisfaction with the council direction for the dissolution of the design commission and delegation to the hearing examiner, Chair Thompson, I'd encourage you to
No, I don't.
take that up with the city council if you wish, because that was not a staff directed. There was no staff direction involved in that. We received direction from the council. We didn't provide direction on that. Additionally, if I'd be happy to talk to you anytime if you're not satisfied with planning department operations and the way development applications are being processed. I'd encourage you to call me like other people do, and I'd be happy to have a conversation with you about any specific matter that comes up.
Okay.
Commissioner Neese?
Chair Thompson, a way around that may be to get rid of the submittal of a parking study and just stipulate an actual parking count with no range. I notice there's some sections that have a range and then require a site plan and a parking study. And then that sort of opens the door to the city confirming, does this look okay? Does this make sense? And in a way, that's a back check. Well, if we don't like that process, then hard number for the parking count. Many jurisdictions do that. You either meet it or you don't. And, if you want to have more parking, choose a higher number that's in the range, I guess.
That's my thinking.
Yeah. I did want to ask Adam, sort of a general question about the clear and objective standards, because as I read through this, I had a hard time figuring out why some things were struck and why some other things were not. I'm wondering if you could give me just a little bit of overview of what that process was. And as I go through it, that might help me evaluate like why certain things were left and certain things were not. Obviously, we can't go line by line, but.
Sure. So as we were reviewing 1911 and 1912, those two chapters of the code are where our design standards are established for inside town center and outside town center. As we were going through that and reviewing it, it was really, we were looking for those specific things that had no measurable. There were many of the provisions that were just generally the design commission can decide this. There's no criteria for it. The design commission has that discretion. So if I missed one, certainly highlight it. But that was really the process, was just trying to make sure if I got the application in and I'm reviewing it, can I read something that the applicant can submit that would actually prove that they meet this? Like, is there something that they can say in their narrative? Is there something they could say on their site plan that I can say this application meets that criteria? So if there's a place that was the lens through which this was kind of evaluated. On the parking piece, just before we move off it, because I'm sure we'll talk about this again. If that's something that the planning commission wants to request, in terms of like setting a minimum, I'm all for having a flat something and we can tell an applicant, you've got to have this many or this many. Like, a range doesn't work for me either. But like, if that's something that the planning commission wants to do, that would be another one that can go in the parking lot. We can make a finding about it, because we'll need to do some evaluation of where the right number is. We don't want to just kind of guess based on our ranges today. So there's just a bit of analysis we would need to do kind of in addition to set those minimums. So did that answer one non-question and your other question? Yeah.
Yeah, that helped. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Any other comments or questions?
Maybe I can just sort of say something. After the 6 years on the design commission, I can say I think there was one time that we talked about parking in the design commission, and there was a challenge associated with the Xinhua development and how that parking was coming together. Most of the commentary had to do primarily with interpretations. Is my microphone going in and out? Okay. Interpretations associated with the again, I brought this up earlier, the idea of variations in facades, differentiation of materials, indications, the appropriate indications of using concrete. So it was very interpretive. I think it still will be somewhat challenging to be able to determine clear standards while maintaining directional variation or interpretation on the client side or the submitter side. I see that as something that we'll have a chance and opportunity, especially on the architectural side, to offer some input and clarity on as best we can.
For sure.
So-
And I would venture to guess this will not be the last time this group touches the design standards at
Yeah.
some point. It may not be 2026, but it'll be at some point. I'm sure we'll come back to the design standards as well. And I one thing that I think maybe got lost in our discussion tonight, that I just wanted to touch on one time before we call it a night, and that's when the design commission was dissolved. The way that was affected was by reassigning any quasi-judicial review to the hearing examiner. So anything that the design commission would have done in a public hearing is now a public hearing before the hearing examiner. So as you're going through and looking at the changes, we didn't lose any of that part of the public process. It just has been reassigned. And it's a little tricky to find that thread as you're going through. it'll be helpful to return to chapter 1915 for the process, for any kind of process stuff, because that's really where that lives in this draft is chapter 1915 of the code. So just for some help as you guys are going through this, because like I said, I know it's a ton and there's plenty here.
All right. Are there any other comments?
I wanted to, I'm sort of thinking out loud here, but seeing how this is going to go, since there's so much material to get through, I guess my concern is sometimes writing amendments, at least for me, takes quite a bit of time. And so I've made a first pass through and have notes, but not formulated any sort of amendment for those notes yet. There might be items where I don't know that it's even worth my time to try and put amendment in. So I might just have sort of a staff question, or is this an issue? I can't tell, kind of thing. If there's like a bunch of those, and I'm just thinking about the timeline, are we gonna have another opportunity to, is there enough time to go back and then formulate those questions once you give feedback into amendments? I feel like we're trying to condense all of this.
Yeah.
So I want to get a sense of how that would work.
So definitely, all the way up until you make your recommendation, there is the opportunity to refine the draft. So there's never, I just put the date of September 17th out there because I needed a time where I can formulate the material to get to you. But if something occurs to you on the 19th, it's not like game over at that point. I would say if you find that you have a bunch of those clarifying questions, that'd be a great reason to reach out, and you and I can meet and kind of go through those. And then if there's questions that you feel like the commission needs to hear, we can put those in the matrix and get those out there. But I'm here to help with that process because again, we are kind of on a crunch. But if we get through the 17th and something occurs to you the day before the planning commission public hearing, we can look at that. That can be brought before the group. So there's not like a hard cutoff, but I would definitely recommend reaching out if you've got a bunch of questions. We can run through that at a time that would work. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Anything else?
So
The only thing I was going to say is just, I appreciate staff, what you've done to this particular point. I mean, this is a tremendous amount of work to get us here. I appreciate the early omnibus briefing. And the clarity and the way that things are laid out here is very, very helpful. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll thank you, Adam, for
Yeah.
all the work to date, and thank you for making yourself available in between now and
Mhm.
next Wednesday. And I encourage all the commissioners to take advantage of that time so we can have a good meeting next time. Okay, now we will move on to other business. Is there a staff report this evening?
Just a brief one. I think as everyone's aware, we have a full agenda of meetings coming up in the next couple of months, and we're currently scheduled to meet again in 2 weeks, and then we have 2 meetings in October. So I think just keep us posted if anyone has conflicts with those, and we're going to be continuing to dig into this draft and move that forward. I did want to come back to the Growth Management Hearing Board decision. I think that was mentioned once or twice earlier in the meeting, but the Growth Board did issue its decision on August 1st. And the staff has been spending the last, 5 or 6 weeks since then, really poring over that decision and trying to understand what it means and the implications and what our strategy will be to comply with that order. We have a timeline to address everything by the end of July 2026. So that's really quite a compressed timeline for this type of work. You may be aware we spent about 3 years working on the periodic update of the comprehensive plan, and while this order is mainly about the housing element, it also will definitely affect other areas of the plan, including potentially transportation and capital facilities. So it is a substantial amount of work that will be required to comply. And we're doing a lot of work behind the scenes now to analyze our options and identify a recommended path forward. I think it's going to be a little while yet while we work through that. And we're anticipating that, we'll be bringing a scope and schedule to the city council at the top of 2026 for the review and approval, and then really digging into the legislative review of the code and comprehensive plan amendments that will be necessary next year.
Allison, this is Dan. I understand that the city has appealed a couple provisions. The city was successful on about 95% of the assignments from the petitioners. The sub area map is not going to be very hard. There's hardly any land in there that could be subject to development. But I understand that on the housing element, it has been appealed essentially because there is no solution. But is that correct, that it's been appealed?
I'll let Kim speak to the appeal.
Thanks, Allison. We appealed one issue that the city lost on, and that was how the land capacity analysis needed to be done for, I'll call it affordable housing.
And by the way, I thought your briefing was excellent.
Thank you very much. Wish you were on the board.
And before the board, and that is, sometimes you think that it's the Addams family. That's just me speaking. You can't say that.
Okay.
But it was very, very good briefing.
Thank you.
That's anything else, JB?
And then just one clarification, that nothing that we're looking at in the omnibus is directly related to how that ruling.
No, there's a little bit of overlap in some of the topics that were part of the appeal, including step housing, but I think anything that's happening with the omnibus will not address the things that were found, not in compliance as part of the GMA decision. So, I think they're two separate things, and getting this done will help clear the decks for that work that's to come. And it's not gonna, push us in one direction or the other in terms of complying with the board's order. It's just necessary for other reasons.
All right. Any other comments or questions? Okay. The next meeting is a regular meeting scheduled for Wednesday, September 24th at 6 p.m. There being no other business to come before the Planning Commission, the time is now 7:28 p.m. and the meeting is concluded. As a reminder to commissioners, please stay seated until staff has terminated the broadcast.